Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I'm going to talk about business PhD program basics and 16 different things that you probably should know before you go to business school and you start pursuing graduate school in business. So this is really applicable for anybody that's thinking of doing a PhD in a business school. So it would be if you're doing a PhD in finance, PhD in strategy, PhD in accounting, marketing, all that kind of stuff. So this would probably be most relevant for you, but it's really applicable for anybody that is thinking about doing graduate school and doing sort of research in a business school, right? So what are these 16 different things that you should know? So first of all, and by the way, if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship. So I'm kind of I'm well acquainted with this kind of stuff. So anyways, first thing is that most faculty are actually, they really want people to succeed and they're pro-social. They're not, there's a lot of people in a lot of faculty that are not necessarily pro-business, and they're thinking about, what's the impact of business on the environment, for example, and things like that, sort of questions like that. It's not necessarily that they are looking for for business to succeed above everything else, but they view it a little bit differently. They view it as, and this is the second thing, is that most people most faculty in a business school view business and organizations as a tool and not necessarily like the thing to sort of maximize, right? And that's it. That's a big thing to sort of think about. That's a big sort of change in mind. So it's a tool to to tackle things like climate change, for example, or a tool to sort of change the world in a positive way. And it's not just to have people make a bunch of money and sort of focus on that kind of stuff, right? So that's an important thing to think about going forward. There's lots of people that sort of focus on financial markets and things like that, and that's all and good. But there's just as many people that are focused on the stuff that are pro-social or pro-environmental and stuff like that. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I think business schools get a bad rap for sort of public perception, as they get a bad rap, and business school faculty get a bad rap for that, for not sort of focusing on the environment. They just have a different perspective on how to accomplish it. A third thing, and this is sort of relevant to this discussion, is that I think for the most part, greed is discouraged in a lot of business schools, and most faculty would probably discourage sort of greedy behavior because it's non-productive. You actually get more politicking and people trying to, not sort of take the organization or take the sort of bigger picture and multiple stakeholders in the sort of bigger picture, right? So that's an important thing to think about. It's not necessarily that greed and sort of self-interest is not important. We sort of recognize that. A lot of people recognize that as an important sort of driver of human behavior. It's just that it is, it's viewed as it's good with sort of constraint. And if you think about it with the constraint is the sort of pure greed, is sort of being politicking and pushing other people down and things like that. That's absolutely would be discouraged in the business school. And I think virtually almost all faculty would sort of discourage that kind of behavior. And they would encourage people to be, view sort of self-interest and maximizing not just one person's sort of wealth and viewing it as a zero-sum game, what's called a zero-sum game. That's where if one person gains, everybody else loses. But viewing it as kind of like, if one person gains, then maybe everybody else can benefit from that as well, and sort of viewing sort of situations where that could happen. And that's an important sort of perspective. And I think most scenarios in business actually have this where one person gains and everybody else benefits sort of setup, right? So that's the idea and strategy is you want to create value for somebody else and then capture a little bit of that value. Depending on what it is. Okay, so a fourth thing that's important that you probably won't realize is most of the stuff that you're going to learn in business school, if you do a PhD or graduate school, in the business school, it's going to be pulled from other disciplines, unfortunately. There is, so generally what you can view business school or the stuff that you learn in business school, it's using organizations or entrepreneurship or innovation or accounting or whatever it is as a particular context to study something that's a little bit more fundamental than that one particular thing. It's just really an interesting context where lots of stuff happens. It matters in the world. Most stuff that we do is sort of organizational in the world or market-based in the world. So those things are important contexts to study. And there is fundamental things that we like to study using sort of more fundamental science. And the more that you can be sort of fundamental, the sort of more basic science, or the more that's encouraged, I guess, in terms of that. So it tends to, a couple of other things about doing, sorry, I have some notes in front of me. So a couple of things to think about with a business school PhD. It is not going to be applied in any sort of way. So you can sort of do an applied degree, and that would be a DBA, for example, but Doctorate of Administration sort of degree, except for at Harvard, they're a little bit unique. But generally, it is very much a research degree if you're doing a PhD or if you're doing a master's program, not an MBA, but a master's program. It's very much a research degree where you're going to be reading papers, writing papers, and analyzing data and things like that. So it's very much more of a it's very much more of a research degree than what you'd assume it to be. If you're thinking of going in, getting a business PhD to go start a business or something like that, highly would discourage that and just go do an MBA. That'd be your best bet. So business schools tend to actually have, so this is the sixth thing, I'm already on the sixth thing. Business schools tend to actually have a lot of resources available to do research, and they tend to work a little bit differently in a lot of different ways. In sort of hardcore science, like chemistry or whatnot, biology, you tend to have to do a lot of grant writing and getting grants. But in business schools, there's a lot of self-funding opportunities. So writing grants and things like that is not necessarily as big in business schools. And I think that's pretty universal across business schools. Although when I was in Canada, and I know that in Europe, it's a lot different where you do have to write grants, but you're doing it, it's supplemental in a lot of different ways. So you do get a certain amount of money like you would, anywhere else, but then you supplement sort of your research capabilities with these grants, right? So you would have SSHRC, which is a SHRC in Canada, that is like the NSF funding that you get here. NSF is it's hard to get in the US. So not a lot of people apply for NSF. Because of that. Okay, and generally there is private funding. There can be private funding depending on what kind of institutions you're at and stuff like that, where you can find different resources through private sources. But there's usually in a business school, it's kind of a mix where there's both private and public, and there's kind of a real mix between these two these sources, right? So you end up blurring the different sources that you get. And so sometimes you might be sponsored by a private, entity, whatever it is, they're giving scholarships and things like that, or grants and things like that. And as well as you might be heavily funded by public sources. So, and it turns out that public sources are still major sort of, they're very important at most universities. It doesn't, private doesn't sort of take everything. The vast majority of most universities, research is publicly funded, which is a positive thing. And a huge chunk of it's publicly funded in sort of various different ways. So you have to think about that. Okay, so what's really important, so a seventh thing that you should know is that having a cohort of people that you work with on a regular basis and to do your PhD with is incredibly important. It helps you a lot to have this sort of people to rely on and people to discuss ideas with. So a PhD is largely a solo endeavor, but if you can find your small crew, and I'm not talking about having a big cohort that you're working with where, you're going to be talking to 30 different people, but find your small crew. And it's usually, so me personally, it's a half a dozen people that you might talk to or get advice from, and then your larger network as well. But find that sort of small crew of people that you can hang out with and rely on to get advice. That's going to be very incredibly important for you to navigate all of the sort of personal issues that you have, as well as dealing with research issues along the way. A ninth thing that I didn't realize, is there is this very large status effects and sort of a pecking order that happens in virtually everything in a university environment. So universities are highly ranked. People are trying to go up in this sort of pecking order. With the university system, they're constantly trying to move up into different, bigger and better things. There's also a pecking order within the universities in general in terms of which sort of programs get the most amount of funding. There's a pecking order. And pecking order, I don't know if you know this sort of analogy, you probably don't. So I believe it's like, like poultry animals, they sort of rank order depending on, who's the most senior or the highest status within the sort of yard, and they get the ones that are first to eat and stuff like that, right? Like a lot of animals are that way, and so it's called a pecking order. So basically, it's a status ranking that happens, right? So lower status, you start at the bottom. When you're a PhD, your lowest status that you could possibly have. And then you work your way up into higher status until you become a full professor or a super, uber professor, whatever it is, the endowed professor. Sometimes they get like chaired professors and things like that. So that's important to think about. And because of that, so this is the 10th thing, is there is a lot of competition. So it's highly competitive in all areas of a PhD. They're always vying for resources, and you're just competing for similar resources that's available. So and all other things that come along with that, it's also very visible and very public with what you're doing. So your CV and resume is known to everybody, and everybody knows what you're doing. So there's lots of competition that happens, and all of the positive things and sort of negative things that competition encourages, right? So if you're that kind of person that likes competition and sort of thrives in that, it's actually a really good environment. And some people just, it's very hard on them as well. And there's lots of negative things with competition, sort of the emotional aspects and stuff like that. So, and so you're always going to be competing for a large part of your career. It's very much competition all the way through. Even when you're a super emeritus professor or whatever it is, you're still going to be like, well, that person over there next to me has X number of publications more than me, or they have an econometrica, or they have, a science or a nature or whatever, and I don't. So there's always this sort of competition that happens with it. I think the biggest reason that people, so this is number 11, the biggest reason that people actually quit a PhD program or quit doing research and sort of get out of the game. And there's lots of people that do that. A huge number of people that get out of the game, whether it's during their PhD program, and the game is like doing research, whether it's during their PhD or after they become, tenured or assistant professor or whatever it is. It's simply because it's not because they're not smart enough. Everybody is very smart that is around you. It's simply sort of a motivational thing in what they are doing going forward and thinking about what they're going forward, right? So they just a lot of people just lose a lot of steam. It's very exhausting, simply because it's not exhausting that it is like, it's hard, but it's not like it is, you're not digging ditches or anything like that, but it is because you have these sort of long outcomes that happen, right? So you write something and you have to wait for years, and you might work on something for 2 or 3 years and then gets rejected and you can't get that thing published anywhere, right? So it's a little bit demoralizing that way. And there's lots of negative feedback that happens along the way. Everything about it is negative feedback. And that is because instead of using it as sort of emotional response, you should be using it as information about like what is wrong with your paper, rather than like your paper is garbage. So you just have to think about that going forward, right? Use it as information rather than actually the emotional aspect of it. Try to separate that as much as you possibly can. So an important thing that I didn't really know this at all, and I didn't when I was young. I was kind of like, so number 12, people do a PhD and they do a doctorate in a business school, or they go to business school not because of the money at all. That is, I mean, there is definitely people get paid well, and you're not going to starve. When you're a PhD student, it's a different story. It's hard, and you don't have a lot of money, and you can run out of money. But when you are, you pass that stage, people do it because that they are, it's not for the money. They can make a lot more money in industry and doing things that are sort of industry related, management consulting or finance. And a lot of people actually exit those careers that are highly lucrative, making, a couple $100,000 a year, to go and do a PhD and sort of live that life. Lots of sort of CEO types and things like that do that. And it's because that they're motivated by something else. And it's not the money. They're going to make a lot more money in industry, private industry. It's because they are motivated by something, whatever it is, right? Maybe they love to teach. Maybe it's the research game that they love, and that they want to do sort of analytical stuff. That's an important thing to think about, right? So that they are doing things because they want to be there, and that's a really different motivation than doing it because you're making money. And so there is competition, but it's competition based on other things, and everybody's unique and different. So you're not going to know what those other things are and what those personal motivations are going forward. An important thing for me, and in number 12, yeah, okay, 12, right? It is, what I would encourage you to do is to pick a university or pick a PhD program that you like the people that you work with and work around, rather than based on sort of the reputation of who's there and the reputation of the particular school. I think that's going to benefit you a lot more, and you're going to be a lot more productive if you're doing that. There's lots of institutions that are highly well sought after, but then they are so what ends up happening is that the sort of intellectual firepower changes on a regular basis, right? So there'll be one particular school that will be really hot for a little bit because there's a group of people that are really interesting at that particular school. And then another one will be really hot for a little while. And so there's all this moving around. It's because people move around constantly, and people get attracted to people that are doing interesting things. And they really like the things that are interesting, right? So they go to the institutions that are doing really interesting things. So one school can be very hot for a bit, and then it'll fizzle out. Some of the very higher status schools, they tend to be hot all the time, and it's just because people are attracted to those particular schools, right? That they're and then, but they're trickier to sort of navigate in the sort of politics and stuff like that that are at those particular institutions. So that's an important thing to think about going forward, is to pick the people that you would like to work with rather than the reputation of the school. So try to figure out who those particular people that you resonate with, and that makes a lot of sense for you. I think that's important advice, and it took me a long time to sort of figure that out. And I'm still grappling with that, but it's important advice to sort of think about, right? Of like, what is the appropriate level of the sort of reputation and versus like the that everybody that you like at that particular institution. And I think the best advice is to pick the institution that you would really like to be at, and that the people are really genuine and really nice. I think you're going to be a lot more productive, and sort of do a lot better at a particular place than that. Okay, so the what's okay, so and another thing that you should think about is what's really important is to acknowledge that doing research is really hard, and doing a PhD is really hard. Graduate school is very extremely hard to do, and most people actually just give up along the way. I sort of pointed that out earlier. And it's not because they're not smart enough or anything like that. I've met a lot of smart people. I'm not at all smart enough to sort of keep going at this, but I still do. I think you have to be a little bit insane, a little bit irrational to sort of keep pursuing at something like this, because that there is opportunities other places, but it is really, you do it because you're motivated for other things, and it's really fun and exciting for other reasons. So you have to think about that people are really not motivated for the money itself. They're motivated to to do something, and it's because that doing research is extremely hard and difficult. And once you start doing it, you start to realize how hard and difficult it actually is. If it was really easy, everybody would be doing it, right? Because they would look at sort of monetary, the wages and salaries and stuff that you get, and then everybody would do it. It's just because it's really hard that a lot of people just don't do it. There's lots of stages along the way that you go through to get to that point where you're a full professor and you're a superstar. Okay, so an important thing to also think about, I sort of lost track, I think I'm at 15 right now, is that most people that work at a business school, so most faculty, and PhD students and stuff like that, they are people too. So it's important to sort of realize that you read, you look at their CVs, and you sort of see this, you see one sort of sheet representing of who they are, but then when you get to know them and you get to understand who their personalities are, you really realize what they're about and what they are doing. So some people are very nice, and very warm and welcoming and just spectacular human beings, and then other people are not so nice, and that they have different motivations and things like that. So you just have to realize that the people that work at business schools, they're people too. And the sooner you sort of understand that, you kind of get to sort of the politics and why things are done certain ways. I'm just going to ignore that. But so the last thing is, this is an important thing. So I don't know if you can hear that. It's my phone ringing. I'm just going to ignore it. It's usually telemarketers on that line. All right. So the last thing is you do learn a lot about yourself. You learn more about yourself during a PhD than you actually learn about the particular discipline or the area that you're actually studying. So you learn sort of how you actually function going forward, and that's an important thing. And you won't understand what I'm talking about until you're about 3 or 4 years in. You're going to realize that oh my God, that they keep calling. So you're going to learn so much about yourself along the way that you're going to be very, very surprised about who you are and what you can accomplish. And it's not necessarily, hey, they hung up. It's not necessarily the discipline or the area of research that you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn a lot about them, but you're going to learn more about yourself. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I suppose I got to go answer that phone. All right, take care. Give me a thumbs up and have a wonderful day. Bye.